There's been a lot of developments, politically speaking, across the world and nationally here in Canada. I've invited Professor Joe Garcea from the Political Science Department here at the University of Saskatchewan to help shed some light on some of these important aspects that's happening around the world. So, Professor, thank you for taking time out today.
Thank you for inviting me, Randy. It's nice to be here. Sometimes we talk about these things off camera. Kind of nice to do it on camera.
Here's a good idea.
Yeah.
When you look at some of the major developments internationally, what can you tell us about that versus here in North America and more so at home?
Well, I think when we look at developments internationally this past year, we really have to talk in terms of some crises that have occurred. And three crises are first and foremost the refugee crisis in the Middle East that affected most of Europe. And I think the other thing we have to think about is the crisis in the Ukraine in terms of the Russian intervention and Crimea that's happened over the last year or so. And I think to some extent too, there have been certain elections in certain countries that have generated results that really weren't anticipated. And so we're seeing more radical parties starting to make radical extreme parties, making inroads into the political sphere of those countries.
How does that affect us here in North America and Canada with the election that we've just had?
Well, in Canada, we've had some interesting elections this past year as well. Of course, the national election with Trudeau, which we can talk about a little bit more. And the other significant one, of course, has been the one in Alberta, the provincial election. There have been a few other elections too that have been somewhat significant, but I think that one has attracted the most attention. And in terms of what's been happening in the world and what's happened at the national and provincial level here in Canada, I think what we're seeing is what Bob Dylan would have described as the times they are a-changing. And I think that we're seeing people seeking a different kind of politics, different kinds of policies. And some are going to the right in some countries and some jurisdictions, and others are swinging more to the left. So it's kind of interesting to see what's been happening. But there's no doubt in my mind that what we're seeing is not just, well, we're seeing patterns of evolutionary change, but we're also seeing transformative and, of course, unfortunately in some cases, revolutionary change of the worst kind. So as we look across the globe and we look at Canada, we're seeing patterns of evolutionary politics and transformative politics, and in some cases, revolutionary politics.
Is there anything to be said with regards to monetary policy in some of these countries where there is a bit of a change that's perceived or sought after by some of the residents there?
Certainly, the crisis in Greece, that's yet the extreme end where essentially an entire economic system looked like it was going to fail if it wasn't for a bailout. But we're seeing that increasingly countries have to be a little more mindful of the way they manage their finances, but we're also seeing that dependency that some countries have on others in order to support them at various points in time. So it's a very complicated issue, but you have global institutions that try to, and regional institutions like the European Union, that try to moderate what happens and help to fix some of the problems that arise economically in some countries.
Do you see some borders becoming strengthened and other borders kind of minimizing their impact in terms of this is my country and we're going to put up more walls and as opposed to Reagan telling Gorbachev years ago to tear down this wall? Are we seeing that type of an influx?
It's a very interesting question, Randy, because I think we're seeing both. In a way, we're seeing efforts to tear down the economic walls, in terms of trade in particular. So we're seeing a lot of trade agreements. On the other hand, what we're seeing is people asking for blocking the walls in terms of human migration. So tear down economic and build, economic walls and build migration walls. And that's an interesting situation because to a large extent, people are moving because of the poor economic conditions that then in turn creates certain kinds of dynamics, certain kind of political dynamics in various countries. So those are interrelated. And so I think what we need is to look globally. We need to look at the global economic system, and we need to look at global migration systems as well and try to reconcile those two things. Otherwise, there's going to be pressures and conflicts and who knows, even more wars.
When we have the ease of movement of people, never mind in between bordering countries, but now across the globe, Canada bringing 25,000 by the end of March, that's pretty significant compared to years ago. There might have been shiploads of people coming in 3 or 4 months. Are there some factors that will influence where people look to come to? In other words, if there's a more of a pro-democratic type of country, do people migrate to that? Or I can't imagine anyone wanting to stay in a dictatorship type of scenario.
Well, I think that migrants often don't have the choice, and they're refugees in particular, immigrants. It's a slightly different matter, but with refugees, they in some cases they don't want to leave at all. But if they leave, they like to be a country close to their homeland. And secondly, I think they like to go to countries where there's opportunity and where there's a certain degree of acceptance, if you will, so that neither they nor their children will be subjected to a lot of marginalization, racism, and discrimination and lack of opportunity. So they're looking for the land of opportunity, and Canada continues to be seen as a land of opportunity by many, even though it's a bit farther afield from where the refugees originate.
Saskatchewan, difficult to say, easy to draw, and I think when some of the stories that we've been hearing so far are very interesting. How is Saskatchewan playing out on the national stage, given what's happened across different provinces this past year with some of the elections? What do you see happening with the April election coming up?
Well, I think that nobody is expecting a radical shift in terms of the provincial election, notwithstanding the radical shifts that have occurred elsewhere. I think that right now people are worried about the economy here, and the question is whether there needs to be continuity or change, and there's a sense that maybe this is a time where steady as she goes, and so there may be some changes in some ridings. Especially because several MLAs are retiring, so the incumbency factor will not be as significant, but the government continues to enjoy relatively strong support. So the NDP has a bit of an uphill battle if they want to make some gains in the province.
Do the boundaries that were changed for the federal election, offering more urban-based voting and seats, do you see that changing? There's to be 2 or 3 more seats in the provincial election?
Well, I think that the whole question of whether boundary changes outcomes is hypothetical and difficult sometimes to guess and sometimes difficult to prove, because there are many factors that ultimately go into who voters will vote for, and so things don't stay constant. So some people will look at boundary changes and say, well, the outcome was a function of boundary changes, but then they forget to think about many other factors that could have also affected the way people voted in that particular election at that particular time. So I'm not one of those that really believes that you change boundaries and you're automatically going to change outcomes.
What happens with our neighbors to the south with the national election next November in the United States? If we have the Republicans and Donald Trump's success happening down there, what do you see as those reasons for that high rating that he's getting?
Thanks, Randy. That's a great question, which I think many people are struggling with to understand why is Trump so popular. And I can put it quite simply. A few years ago, Reverend Jackson was calling for a coalition of the progressives. And I think what we're seeing with Trump is a coalition of the regressives. all the people that have some kind of it's an anti-establishment kind of movement, the anti-status quo movement that's out there, and there are a lot of people that are disaffected, and basically they're looking for someone who they think is radically different than anything they've seen before. And God, I think we're seeing in Trump something radically different than we've ever seen before. I want to say something, that I think is important for Canadians. There's a sense that some things can only happen in other countries and they can never happen in Canada. We have this sense that we're exceptional in some way and that we're insulated from, potential
immune, I guess.
movements,
Yeah.
and certain kind of developments, whether it's civil war or whether it's, radical politics and radical politicians. And the truth of the matter is that we're not. And I think the Americans felt that way, and we can see with Trump's progress that who knows what will happen. In terms of the Republican leadership, but ultimately in terms of the presidency. And so the question is, could he end up with a coalition of the regressives and the disaffected that will ultimately lead him to the leadership of the Republican Party and possibly to the presidency? And I think that it's a warning in a sense to Canada to be careful what we do, how we do it, and also the kind of electoral system that we generate. There's a sense that sometimes certain kinds of electoral systems will protect you against certain things happening. I'm not sure. I mean, some people say, well, if we move towards proportional representation, we're going to get the possibility of more splinter parties and radical extremist groups rather than these coalition type of big tent political parties. And therefore, we're going to end up with people like Trump getting a platform. But you can see it happens even when you don't have proportional representation, as in the States. So again, there's some people think that electoral systems make a difference in terms of the outcome, but not necessarily so. But you do have to be careful that sometimes you don't create systems that may facilitate certain things from happening. And but it's not just the electoral system. I think you have to think about the policies. I think you have to think about the way you govern so that you minimize that kind of disaffection. You minimize that radicalism that takes you to extreme. Change is good. Extremism is something that I think we all have to fear because it's happened in other parts of the world and we don't want it to happen here.
And we can do that by voting.
By voting and good governance. That's why we really need people to be sensible.
Perfect. Professor, I want to thank you for making time today. It's always enlightening to talk to you, and I look forward to doing this again.
Thanks, Randy. I enjoyed it, and I look forward to another invitation.
We'll be right back.